Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
We have what we call a Dharma dialogue, which I think is an old tradition here. And in this process, I'll give a talk maybe for 30-35 minutes, and then we'll see where the discussion wants to go. We could have a good chunk of time to follow things, and we can also, in the process, maybe it'll lead us to have the last period of the time. We have till noon. Maybe the last period of time will be silent practice again. And actually, in my talk, I will bring in periods of short practice. So that'll be part of, it won't be entirely just talking, it'll be pointing to ways of practicing. And this will be exploring generally the theme of the retreat of cultivating clear seeing and a kind heart, which are the fundamentals of our practice. We could use other language, but that's one way of talking about them. So in the Buddhist tradition, not to mention other spiritual traditions, or even more contemporary approaches in psychology and other ways to develop, there are all sorts of practices, but if we point to Buddhist tradition, all sorts of practices and teachings, very, very helpful. Many of them, many different techniques of meditation. They all point beyond themselves. That the goal of all the practices and the techniques and even all the teachings is to make themselves irrelevant. It's not usually the perspective given. They point beyond themselves. They point to where all these practices, techniques lead, which is, we might say, a kind of deep resting in one's own being, in which there are no techniques, no practices, in a sense, not even a teaching. But more a kind of resting in our being, and then letting one's life and being in the world come out of that. That's where all this points to. So we may remember that the Buddha said, "My teachings are like a raft to go to the other shore." When you get to the other shore, you don't walk around with the raft on your back. Okay? We could say, as some of you know, in the more advanced parts of Tibetan practice, it's actually called non-meditation in the Mahamudra tradition. It's called non-meditation, and it points beyond ordinary techniques. And I also was thinking of the Taoist tradition, in which a kind of profound non-doing permits a doing to come out of non-doing. It's called wu wei, or translated as non-action. And it is, different language is used, but it's a way of acting in the world which comes out of a profound inner stillness and emptiness, a non-doing, a doing that comes out of non-doing. So different expressions point in this way. I'll just say that at the beginning as a reminder, and then talk the rest of the time about teachings and practices. So, in a way, I'm saying, we'll put an asterisk on the rest of the talk. Right? So the teachings and practices are very important, and it could be a problem to think, I've arrived at the point where techniques and practice and teachings are not relevant. Right? That could be yet another way of confusion. Right? And so there are many teachings and practices, and part of what we do in retreat is we come back to, again, what we might call a period of training to immerse ourselves more in teachings and practices, many very familiar, and in a way remind ourselves, and do so with the support, as we've seen, of community. And we need to do this training. And so I'll talk about several different teachings and practices, particularly of the kind that lead to clear seeing. We might say the wisdom teachings, the teachings that lead to insight. And then towards the end of the day, bring in more the heart practices, the compassion. And then tomorrow, we'll have another Dharma dialogue, which will be more focused on bringing this into daily life, in some sense, embodying it. So again, bringing in those three dimensions of wisdom, the kind heart, and the embodiment of all of this in our everyday life, our everyday actions. So as I speak, see what calls to you. Maybe one or two call to you. People are at different places in terms of practice, and in terms, as we heard, with the intentions. For many of us, it's sort of reconnecting more deeply with the practice. And for others, it may be really just having a delightful weekend of practice with friends, right? And the practice is actually going fairly strongly, but it's a chance to re-enliven it and so forth. So it'll be different for different people. The starting point for most of our practice is gaining more stability of mind. And we might find that that's where the emphasis has been so far last night, today, maybe a good part of today, really coming back to more stability of mind, focusing either through the breath or through some other means of developing more stability, less distraction, being with what's surfacing that's still there from the last few weeks or months or whatever. That is surfacing, the mind's going here and there, unresolved issues, resolved issues, all sorts of things. And so we need to have that stability in order to see clearly. Without stability of mind, we are more in the loops of our thinking, or just having our attention driven more habitually. So we need that stability, and we could have a whole retreat on developing stability of mind, developing samadhi. The English word concentration is often used as a translation of samadhi, and it can be a little misleading because concentration, at least in English, for many of us means trying hard, And the essence of samadhi is a little bit different. And the actual etymology of the word samadhi is more like a gathering together or a bringing together, and doesn't have that connotation of really kind of intense striving and effort, which is often the connotation of concentration. So we want to remember that when we are stabilizing our attention, it's, in the long run, involves no deliberate effort at all. That it's a natural quality of the mind to be stable with the mind quiet. It's a natural quality that may not be experienced that often. Right. But that's where the practice goes. That's where even as one develops in samadhi, the practices and techniques become increasingly not necessary, although they can be helpful. Okay. And so just a few words on this, that for many of us there can be tendencies to over-effort. Anyone relate to that? Yeah. And so we want to know that. We want to know if our tendency is to over-effort or to under-effort. How many tend to under-effort? Right? So how many tend to do both of those at different times? At the same time. Right. And so it's good to know that. And when we're first starting our session, even to set the intention to move in the opposite direction. If I'm feeling like I have a tendency to overstriving now, say, let me have my skillful effort, but let me balance it with ease and more like a resting. Ultimately, there's a combination of persistence and ease. Okay? And so it can be helpful to just bring in the intention for that balances our typical tendencies. And that's helpful to do. So we may want to practice with that, and often it can be helpful if the mind is not so quiet to do that at the beginning of every session, at least for a while. It could be 10 or 15 minutes. Whether with the breath or some other anchor. Metta, loving kindness practice, is also a way of developing stability. And so we develop more stability, we keep coming back, and the Buddha said that developing more samadhi, more concentration, is ultimately for the purpose of insight. This was his innovation in the tradition. He learned from the teachers he worked with, especially to develop a lot of concentration. And the innovation was to bring in also the insight dimension. At least that's what I've read from scholars. And in fact, he said, practitioners develop concentration. One who has concentration sees things as they are. And then he goes on to say, what does one see? And he went on to say, one sees impermanence. One sees dukkha, which I like to translate as reactivity. One sees anatta, or not self. This is what stability of mind makes possible. But we could ask more broadly, we're practicing insight meditation. What are the insights that we come to? And I think there are of many kinds, right? A lot of what we come to initially is just seeing all the ways our mind and body and hearts work, right? We notice that. We have insights into our own personal tendencies and habits. A very key part, to notice that we Like for me, a major initial insight was that I plan a lot. When I first was practicing, we have any planners here? Okay. I come from a planning family. My sister has an advanced degree in planning. It's true. She got her master's degree in urban planning. And she's made her living in working with Kaiser and doing health planning. So using planning for the benefit of sentient beings. And so that was one of my first insights. Gosh, I'm a planner. I would sit down and meditate, and I was a student when I was first learning, and I would have to give a report in class in 3 days, and I would sit out and then plan it out for the next 20 minutes, right? And I came to the deep insight that I planned a lot. That's important, right? That's important just to see those tendencies, to notice that, to notice our habits, to notice what keeps coming up. Sometimes the insights are more, we might say, of an intuitive nature. We see in a moment of quiet, we have an intuition that helps us resolve some unresolved issue, right? How many have that occur quite frequently, right? Or sometimes, Yeah, that's another kind of insight, that the quiet mind permits what we call intuition to work more fully. Beautiful, beautiful aspect of our being. And then there are also those 3 areas that the Buddha named, seeing impermanence, seeing dukkha, or reactivity, often translated as suffering, and seeing anatta, often translated as not self, sometimes as no self, right? And so these are actually the 3 areas for the tradition, for the Buddha, where there is what the British teacher Rothberg called seeing that frees, insight that is freeing. And that's a beautiful book. Anyone know Rothberg's book, Seeing That Frees? Strongly recommended. It's one of those rare books that is designed for the intermediate or advanced practitioner. Most books, because of the publishing industry, are for beginners, right? It's interesting when you think about it. There are not that many books that are really designed for people who have been practicing a while.
The name again, please.
Seeing That Frees, Rob Burbea, Burbea.
Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful book. It could be the basis for working together, and it's a wonderful book. So I like his language, because we can think of insight practice as seeing that frees, and that the kind of practice that helps us to notice more clearly impermanence and dukkha and not self could be called the 3 modes of seeing that free. Or another kind of language I use is the 3 modes of liberating insight, right? And these were taken to be the insights which then free one and move one more closely to nibbana, or the sacred, or one's deeper nature. That these are the key insights. So I'll talk briefly about each of these and point to a few ways of practicing, again, with the hope that not that we do all of these, but that maybe 1 or 2 of these call for our practice here. So these are impermanence, dukkha, often translated as suffering or reactivity, and not self. And The late West Nisker. People know that West Nisker passed a little while ago? Yeah. Very, very sad in some ways. Wes once said of these three, and he starts with dukkha first. Life is hard. It'll put you through the changes, but don't take it personally. So a few words on each of these. Impermanence. In some ways obvious, right? Everything changes. But taken to be so central, and it's interesting, we could ask, why was this one of the three areas of insight, right? If I asked you, do things change? How many would say yes? Okay. That's the correct answer. Right? But it's said that the Buddha's last words were, everything changes, keep on practicing with care and diligence. The last words of the Buddha. And interesting stories that I've heard, very similar. Once the 16th Karmapa, Tibetan teacher, was invited to the U.S. Congress. They were doing important things, of course, and so they didn't have too much time to spend with him. And they asked him, can you summarize all of Buddhism in one sentence? And his answer was, everything changes. Interesting that he would focus there. Yeah. Very similar story from Suzuki Roshi. And Suzuki Roshi was asked in a similar way. I don't think he wasn't at the U.S. Congress, but someone asked him, can you summarize all of Buddhism in a nutshell? And his answer was the same, everything changes. That's interesting, isn't it? That they went there. And in some ways, again, impermanence is obvious if we reflect on it. We change, the season changes. Sometimes the heat works, sometimes it doesn't. It was not working, now it works. It's sometimes said that we like impermanence when it goes from the unpleasant to the pleasant, and we don't like impermanence when it goes from the pleasant to the unpleasant, but both happen, right? And so on a certain level, it's obvious. And so one way of looking at it is that there are two aspects of impermanence. One we can call more gross impermanence, which is more obvious when we look at it. And the encouragement from the tradition is to look at it. So one way of practicing that's, for example, done in the Tibetan tradition is simply to take 5 minutes or 10 minutes and reflect in an ordinary way about how things change, how the weather changes, how things in one's life change, how sometimes politicians are central, sometimes they fall, sometimes politicians are charged with crimes and sometimes not. Right? Countries rise and fall, everything changes, right? So and I change as well, and I am impermanent as well. So bringing in recollection of death, have that be part of a 5 or 10 minute reflection every day. It's not dramatic necessarily, but it adds up, because unlike some other areas of practice, attention to impermanence, in my experience, deepens not so much by having a lot of aha experiences, but by just repetition, continual looking in the way I just mentioned, or we can also do it in our meditation practice. And that gets into sort of a second way of noticing impermanence, which is more on a subtle level, noticing moment-to-moment impermanence just noticing thoughts coming, emotions coming, body sensations coming. And then as we deepen in our concentration, we also start seeing a more radical flux in our experience. That, those who've been practicing a while have probably experienced that a lot, where the conceptualization is not there so much, and we notice the continual change. We notice how things are continually moving, and we tend to make them more solid with our concepts and our thinking, right? How many know that experience, right? It's beautiful. It's profound. We can be with the tree, the redwood tree, and the sunset in a different way. And we come to see how we all have learned how to construct a world with concepts and with labels, and we stay with things. And one of the possibilities of meditation is to actually go beneath the level of construction somewhat. And we see how things are more radically impermanent than we thought. It's interesting, right? And it can be both liberating and at first can be a little bit scary, right? Like, whoa, whoa, this is not quite so solid and secure as I thought, right? That's where community comes in, and just naming this as just as normal, is important. And so some ways of practicing with that more subtle dimension of impermanence, very simple, could be just to be with one sense, particularly something like hearing or sensation, just to be, for example, with sensations of the breath or the hands touching together, and watch change occur for 10 minutes, right? Very simple way of being with impermanence. Can do it with sound, particularly go out where there's some water and be with the sound. I used to sit by a creek and just be with sound continually. And it's not necessarily dramatic or leading to a aha experience. Like I say, the understanding of impermanence is more cumulative. We just hang out with impermanence over and over again. And we can do it that's a simple way to do it. Just be with a sense that doesn't bring us too much into conceptualization. Vision tends to bring us into conceptualization, but body sensations, maybe feeling the hands or being with the breath, continually noticing the changes, arising, staying, and passing. Some very simple ways with sound. When the mind is quiet, relatively quiet, we can do that with the whole flow of experience sometimes, and just be with the flow, noticing moment to moment what comes up. But a good starting point is just to be with this, one of the senses like body sensations or sound. Could also be with meals. Meals could be a wonderful way to do that, just to be there and watch the continual change. And that actually brings me to the second area, because when thinking of meals, being with the changes, we also start to notice what we like and what we don't like, and where the mind says, "Very pleasant. I like this more," right? And that takes us into the second area, which is that of dukkha, which I like to translate as reactivity. And some of you probably were there when I was at GBF and gave a talk in 2019 on, do you remember, on the 4 meanings of dukkha? And it was later transcribed and published in the newsletter, right? And so that's there as a reference point. So I'll be very brief here. I think the most important meaning of dukkha for our practice is that of reactivity, which means grabbing hold of the pleasant, as in a meal. It can happen. It happened to me with dessert yesterday. Anyone have that with dessert? A little bit of grasping? I was completely full, and as I was going out, I wandered by the dessert, the cake or pie or whatever we call it, and I noticed a thought saying, maybe just a little piece. Anyone have a similar experience? Okay. And I came out of deep wisdom and said, no, I'm full. I don't know if that was wisdom, but... and so it's the grabbing hold of the pleasant and the pushing away of the unpleasant, which we do in many, many ways. It's the level of the body, thoughts, when we are blaming or judging harshly, that's reactivity, right? Reactivity occurs at the level of the mind. Many of us know that teaching of the 2 arrows, which I've given at times. The Buddha said, everyone at times experiences the unpleasant. What distinguishes a practitioner who's skilled from a non-practitioner? And he said, the non-practitioner, when there's an unpleasant experience, will tend, and he called the unpleasant experience the first arrow. He said, the unskilled practitioner, which means us at times, when we're not being skillful, will tend to shoot a second arrow as if that would help, right? Get rid of the first arrow. And in some ways we may think that it does, but ultimately it keeps things going. So the first arrow, let's say I have a shoulder pain, and I may start tensing around it. That's shooting the second arrow. Might start tensing around it. Might start blaming myself. Oh, I didn't do enough yoga. I didn't get ready for this. You didn't do enough. That's the second arrow. I might say, why did I come on this retreat? I could have stayed home and, watched sports all weekend. Hypothetical. Right. And we do that, of course, interpersonally. Someone says something to us we don't like. It's unpleasant. I'm not aware it's unpleasant. I just immediately shoot back something negative, right? That's shooting the second arrow. Most conflicts in the world or between people are two people or two entities shooting second arrows at each other. And so our practice is to learn not to shoot the second arrow. Part of that occurs by being willing to be with the unpleasant, for example, when it's in the workable range. Maybe a body sensation means noticing unpleasant emotions. Part of our practice, which, all of us, I'm sure, do at times. So how to practice with this teaching? One way is to be with what's pleasant or unpleasant and study it, explore it. You can do that during a meal, right? Say, let me just watch it, and let me particularly notice when the sense of pleasant is there. Eating sometimes will just be the taste, the smells, but sometimes there'll be a sense of, I like this, and you can see how it appears in the body, how it appears in the mind. And we can do that in meditation. We can also, when the unpleasant occurs in our meditation, we can label it, and when it's in the workable range, meaning not overly intense, not doing damage like not to stay with body posture where we know that it might not be good for the shoulder. We would shift that. But if it's workable, not causing damage, just to explore, let me be in. Again, most of us, maybe all of us have done this at times. But to have the intention at the beginning of a sitting, let me be with the pleasant and the unpleasant. Notice it when it comes. Notice tendencies to shoot the second arrow. In daily life, it can be something difficult has happened. Watch my tendencies to shoot the second arrow. It's the most common guidance I give when I do one-on-one work with people. You've had something hard happen, difficult happen. watch for the tendencies to shoot the second arrow in all sorts of ways. Blame yourself, blame someone else, very common. Another way to practice is just set the intention at the beginning of a sitting. Let me track for reactivity when it comes, and notice it when it comes up. That's a very wonderful daily life practice as well. And then the third area, which I'll be brief on, is anatta, or not self. And probably, as most of us know, of the three, this is the most conceptually confusing, right? And the way I typically teach it is actually not to try to talk about it too much conceptually, because it is confusing. I'll give some examples of the confusion. The first one, from Jewish Buddhist humor. A very important dharma source. Okay. The Torah says, love your neighbor as yourself. The Buddha says, there is no self. So maybe we're off the hook. So it can be very confusing. The Buddha gave teachings about not self, but once when he was asked, is there no self, he didn't answer. And then the person said, well, is there a self? And the Buddha didn't answer. And this was with a wandering yogi. And then the yogi just walked away and never came back. And then Ananda said, why didn't you answer? Maybe saying, why didn't you teach about anatta, not self? And the Buddha said, if I had said not self, the yogi would have been confused. If I had said self, the yogi would have been confused. So I think this is actually pointing to actually that the truth is beyond either of those extremes, we could say, or the truth of our experience. And just briefly, what I have found in my own teaching is that I like to particularly point to two ways of practicing which help us explore the territory. The first is to, with our practice, open up to ways in which there's less of a strong sense of self. And I think we do this ordinarily in our practice, just by saying, okay, here's a body sensation, here's a thought, here's this, here's that. Being like an observer, just observing what's occurring in our experience, that's kind of thinning out the self, right? So I use the metaphor of being with our experience in a way in which there's a thinning of the self. We can do this just to be outside and let the senses do their work. And that's a very simple way. Be with the meal, let the taste be there, without bringing in much sense of self, without much sense of thinking. Noticing the times when we're deeply absorbed, when we get into that kind of flow state that people talk about. That concept of flow, where we're fully absorbed, maybe listening to music or dancing or being with a friend, right? Where there's not much sense of self, maybe in art or music and so forth. And so finding ways that we're experiencing and noticing them where there's not much sense of self, where it gets thinned out. It happens very much in meditation. And this is what the Buddha said. This is how the training should be done. Concerning this body with its consciousness, let there be no self-centered imaginings of I and mine, and no such bias with regard to external objects. Let there be no self-centered imaginings of mine, and no such bias. We shall then abide in the attainment of the heart's liberation, the liberation by wisdom, by just being with experience, increasingly without that sense of self. But we only can do that by a second way of practicing, which is to notice where there's what I would call a thick sense of self. So I use the metaphor of thick and thin. We thin the self, the sense of self, but then we look for where the sense of self is thick, right? Where we have a lot of self-centered thinking, where we have maybe reactivity. A lot of reactivity is very self-centered. Sometimes where our own wounds come up, where our own places of residual hurt or pain are thick. So we don't want to totally just suppress the thick self. Sometimes the thick self, as I'm calling it, is really there to remind us of the need for healing. Right? That's a really crucial point, right? And so, but a lot of what we can do in our practice is to notice when there's a strong sense of self and study it. And sometimes we do so again for the purposes more of being able to let go, and sometimes it's for the purposes of saying, let me attend to this, I need to, connect this part with healing and transformation. And so those could be two ways of practicing here, very simply. Just our ordinary practice goes into that thinning of the self, but then also look for a thick sense of self and study it. And then I'll close just by reminding us of the connection with the kind heart, that all of these practices can really evoke the kind heart. When we notice impermanence and when we look at our own impermanence, it can bring up compassion. When we notice reactivity and shoot the second arrow, we can know the extent to which that's connected with pain in ourselves and the world. When we study the thick self, again, some of it's connected with what's painful. So compassion can arise very naturally. But I thought I would just end with a little bit of a prose poem from Gary Snyder. And some of you may know this. This was written right after the Taliban destroyed the Buddha statues in Afghanistan, 2001. And I think Gary Snyder had written something about this, and someone wrote back to him, I think it was like maybe a scholar of Buddhism, who said, more or less, why are you getting all worked up about the statues? Aren't they impermanent? And Gary Snyder wrote this as a response, and I think connected our understanding of impermanence with compassion. And he's going to refer in this little poem to a passage from I think it's from a Japanese haiku writer named Issa, who lived in the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, and who had a child, a young son who died, and wrote a haiku about it in the context of thinking about impermanence. And there's also a reference that some of you may know to the Diamond Sutra, which has in the text the passages about impermanence, giving different metaphors like, everything is but like a dewdrop at dawn, right? It will be gone soon. So listen for those references here. April 2001, from a man who writes about Buddhism. Dear Gary, again in relationship to the statues, well, yes, but the manifest dharma is intrasamsaric and will decay. The manifest dharma is intrasamsaric. Never heard that before. And will decay. I said, yes, impermanence. But this is never a reason to let compassion and focus slide, or to pass off the sufferings of others because they are merely impermanent beings. The haiku goes, this dewdrop world is but a dewdrop world, and yet, that's from Isa regarding his son. This dewdrop world is but a dewdrop world, and yet is our perennial practice, and maybe the root of the Dharma. Yeah. Thank you.
Donald, was this getting a wonderful talk getting recorded?
Yeah.
Oh, good. This is good for the newsletter.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe to just have a minute or so quiet and let things settle. Again, in terms of practice, seeing maybe one or two practices or ways of seeing from the talk that may have resonated that you might like to bring into the retreat further. So thank you. Have time for discussion, letting things go where they may. Jeff, please.
Thank you for an incredible talk. It occurred to me that with this dialogue time, there's just one thought that we could have, split up into, say, pods of who wants to deal with Dukkha, Anatta, Nietzsche would be one thought. But also I wonder, you're talking about the three sort of details of what's seen, right? The reactivity, the impermanence, the not self. But I always ask, who is seeing? What is the seeing?
Who is seeing?
Yes, right. Like, not to say there's a self, just like there is a seeing.
Yeah.
And what is that seeing?
Who is seeing? What is seeing?
Yeah, I guess you could say it goes to the who am I question. But
yeah.
There's the object and training of seeing and concentration, and yet where does the seeing come from?
Yeah. This is one reason why I don't go into too much detail conceptually about not self, but there is a simple way of talking about it, about not self. If I would have taken more time there, I would have pointed to kind of like a developmental understanding of self and going beyond self. That and there's a very nice book by Tanasaru Bhikkhu called Selves and Not Selves. And I think I may have brought this with me thinking I might use it. Let's see if I have this. no, not readily available, but I can paraphrase. He basically says that a sense of self is very important initially, and actually for a long time, and that going beyond a sense of self is something that's possible and takes us into a more accurate way of seeing, a fuller way of seeing, but we, as it were, work up to it by practicing in all sorts of ways that require a sense of self. That's the way to say it. So, for example, and Thanissaro Bhikkhu says the self is very crucial at many, many points of our practice, where we, for example, to remember to do our practice, to have accountability, to have responsibility, often takes a sense of self. And, to interact ethically with others requires a sense of self. Often to set intentions in meditation requires a sense of self. So he says the sense of self is required for much of the path. And then there are times when we do go beyond it. But it requires all that we developed using skillfully a sense of self. So he would say there is a skillful use of a sense of self, which is crucial for our practice. And then at more advanced places, we go beyond it. So that's a more developmental sense. That's probably the easiest conceptual way of understanding not self. And there are some further subtleties. One way that I look at it also is that we thin out the sense of self gradually over time. And there's something like even what I've come to call a meditative self. That, one person that I and Clark, maybe some others have worked with, Dan Brown, talks about it as our metacognitive awareness, which is that our sense of, okay, what's right thing to do here? What's a skillful thing to do here? There's a part of in our practice, part of us is sort of tracking what's going on and saying what's useful, what's skillful, how many can relate to that, right? That's a subtle sense of self, but it's a sense of self that's very, very useful. So it's much like the way I began the talk. The deepest place, we go beyond all these senses of self, and we may experience that just for a brief while or in a more stable way, but we work up to that with all sorts of techniques and practices which require a sense of self. Yeah. Well, thank you for the question. Right, please, and then second, and then Clark.
Yeah. As you were talking about the two arrows.
Yeah. Is it possible to remove your mask just for the question? Sure. Yeah.
As you were talking about the two arrows, it arose a common pattern for me, which I suspect for others, and then into a question. So the second arrow for me is often worrying. Is
what?
Worrying.
Worrying, yeah.
So this happened, it was uncomfortable, it's going to get worse, it's blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Goes on and on. And then that tends to morph into reacting, planning.
Yeah.
So what do I do about this? So the state is reaction, but the behavior is worrying. And underneath it lies a belief that if I don't plan and do something, it will get worse.
Yeah.
So body sensations, arguments with my partner, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But I found that sometimes it's often not true.
Yeah.
It may not get worse, it may go away. And so how to direct one's efforts.
How to approach that. Yeah, thank you. And remind me your name?
Lee.
Yeah, thank you, Lee. I think what you brought out helps me bring out a really crucial point that I didn't include in relatively short treatment of reactivity. A few things. First of all, yes, we can see that many forms of shooting the second arrow coming out of a sense of this being unpleasant, right? Which can be connected with thinking, and it will be unpleasant in the future, and it will get worse, or whatever.
And I have to do something.
And I need to prevent my catastrophic future, right? Or minor or major, right? And so number one, just to see that shooting the second arrow is occurring, to bring mindfulness to it, to be aware of it. But it also brings out a complexity related to reactivity that I did not mention just now. So again, I thank you for bringing it up, because it's actually really important. And I'm not experiencing reactivity towards myself for not having mentioned it earlier. But it might happen. Which is that the teachings about reactivity, about grabbing at the pleasant and pushing away the unpleasant, do not mean that one never goes for the pleasant or acts in ways to forestall the unpleasant, right? That I could, in some circumstances, have that second piece of dessert, and it would be skillful. Hint, hint. No. Right? And also, and maybe we can see this more easily in terms of the unpleasant, I may go into reactivity about what's happening now that's unpleasant, worry about it for the future, have a lot of thinking, create negative scenarios, negative narratives, which I often see are actually not realistic, but they're based on fear or worry and so forth, as you were saying. And that it actually may be important to act in a way in relationship to the original situation that brought about the sense of unpleasant or worry. This isn't about passivity, just let everything be, let the unpleasant circumstance just, work itself out. Don't go for what's pleasant or what you like and so forth. It's actually the complexity is that reactivity is complex. It's a mix. Reactivity is a mix often of some insight or intelligence that's actually valuable, mixed up with the reactivity, and so what the practice is to transform the reactivity in the different ways that I've mentioned, especially to be with it, to be present, bring compassion in, and then see if one can address the original situation without the reactivity, right? Two very concrete examples. My coworker doesn't keep an agreement that we made. I notice reactivity in myself. I'm judging and blaming, this is the 13th time. I've counted every one of the first 12. Right? And, I have a lot of reactivity, and it's important to address the original situation. It's unpleasant, but this isn't about squashing it, about passivity. But what I want to do is address the original situation as much as possible without reactivity. And so, can I finish the thought, then I'll get back. And so I do my inner work with the reactivity. Maybe I do it, I feel I'm with my anger, I'm with my frustration, I sit with it, I come to it, and I come to a place where I've worked through it, and actually maybe I'm at a place where I can even bring in some empathy or understanding of where the other person's coming from, right? And maybe I even go, maybe it was a really hard time. I don't know, right? For my coworker. And then with all that process, I can go back and have that conversation, and coming from a place of, as much as possible, of non-reactivity. Second example, and then I'll go back to Lee, also kind of an obvious one, I see social injustice. I can get really reactive about the injustice, right? It's painful, unpleasant, and I can have a lot of reactivity. I'm still shooting the second arrow. It's still actually not ultimately going to be skillful. And so I've done a fair number of workshops with activists about the second arrow, because it's occupational hazard, right? And so what do? Ideally, we do the inner work and we preserve the insight into injustice, and we act strongly as much as possible without reactivity. So that's fleshing it out more. Lee, please.
So that was helpful. And so I think about arguments. So somebody says something unpleasant to me, I say something unpleasant back to them, they escalate, and sometimes it turns into what we call politics or war.
Right.
And so it seems to me that it's perhaps the general category, but again, it's hard to do. It requires wisdom, which is, as I understand it, another aspect of Buddhism. But how does one arrive? And if you have any comments on that?
Yeah, say again that last point.
How do you arrive to respond instead of react, to do it in a way that's beneficial?
That's right.
Rather than harmful. As I understand Buddhism terms, it's wisdom. And
that's right.
How to move towards that.
That's all of our practice. And here we would also bring in practices like skillful speech, empathy, compassion. Here we're more focusing on the wisdom teachings, but that would be ideal. And sometimes it requires, when we have relational issues or social issues, it requires some mix of inner and outer practice, but really keeping that sense of non-reactivity foremost, and again bringing in the compassion aspect as well. But it's completely what's called for in terms where there is friction, reactivity, conflict.
So perhaps looking inward at oneself, experiencing more fully what's happening with me rather than it's about them.
That's right. Yeah, often knowing that there's reactivity, and it depends on the relationship, but telling one's partner, I'm feeling a lot of reactivity. I think it would be much better if we could come back to this conversation in an hour or a day or whatever, something like that. Thanks, Lee. Please. And Clark was third,
I'm Shane.
Shane.
My name is Shane.
Shane, yeah.
And I have a curiosity. So with regard to your question, which is the who am I, what am I question, I'm curious about what you think of this conceptualization that I've heard, and this tends to be, what I tend to work with nowadays, which is that what we are is just simply pure awareness.
Yeah.
And that our experience with each of us as individuals are just a localized manifestation or experience of pure awareness.
Yeah. That what we are most basically is something like pure awareness. People use different language. Some might say love, or some might say total interconnectivity, or something like that. But some sense that connects us with the whole, right? Because the pure awareness is not my pure awareness, right? And that I am a localized version of the pure awareness. I see something very much like that. I could relate to that. And again, it's expressed differently by different teachers, different traditions. But that kind of experience is pretty accessible, at least for short moments, right? And then to have it be more stable, takes the training motivated by localized consciousness to go beyond itself. Because so how many relate to some version of that teaching? Well, that's beautiful. And then again, very, very different expressions. Like I mentioned last night, I think some come through the lens of awareness, some come through the lens of the heart. And some come through the lens, I think, of the body, like maybe interbeing, like Thich Nhat Hanh, interconnectivity, or even everything is just subtle radiating energy, right? And some come through all of the above, or more than one. Yeah. Clark, please.
So my question has to do with working with causation and karma in both the sitting practice and sort of in daily life. And I glanced at a book this morning that's an interview book with the Dalai Lama, and at a certain point he talks about karma, and he says, which I've heard him say before, his physician say before, that when he thinks about what he calls the enemy, the Chinese, and he refers to them as his enemy, he says that he doesn't want, both of them say they don't want to lose compassion. And I can understand that. And the particular way that he relates to it, though, through a kind of karmic understanding, is unsettling for me, because he says his view is that there must have been something that he did in his past life that led this to happen. And sort of at the collective karma level, I'm not a Tibetan historian, but apparently Tibet at one point was an empire and might have actually done, prior Tibetans might have done bad things to prior Chinese. So, I once was at a retreat. It was one of the best teachings I've ever heard was by Guy Armstrong, where he quoted some Theravada text, where the Buddha is asked, does everything come from karma? And if I'm remembering correctly, the Buddha responds, no, everything comes from the laws of causation, but karma is only one, and others are the weather and illness.
Yeah, I know that passage, yeah.
Yeah, and apparently, for what it's worth, apparently John Jeff teaches that that's the straightforward interpretation of that it is wrong, so for what it's worth, but I can't remember the details. So, I think, from a practice point of view, I think it's useful, in just with the body, to recognize, oh, here's this causation. So I noticed, oh, my left piriformis or left glute minor is starting to feel tight, or maybe it was the right initially. It was the left initially, then it was the right. And they just passed away after a little while. But then later I realized, oh, it's come back. And so I thought, oh, this is like the spark before the flame. Better for me to stretch.
Yeah.
So that's sort of one aspect of it, or maybe those are two aspects of it. The last one has to do with skillful self-compassion, where I feel like I want to be able to learn sort of in daily practice, what is my role in this conflict? And it could be like a conflict like Lee's talking about, like a kind of recurrence kinds of interactions with one's partner or with colleagues, and trying to understand that in a way that's skillful for everyone involved. So not beating myself up, oh, I'm a conflictual person, or oh, I'm overreacting. But also being able to sort of intervene.
Yeah.
Long question, but I'm sort of curious how
okay.
daily life.
Quite a few elements. And should I repeat some of it? Maybe people at the back, could you hear? Okay. Okay.
Could you boil it down to a question?
Yeah, I think I can get right at the essence, and I'll repeat it so everyone can hear. Can you hear me okay at the back? Okay. Really, two dimensions. The first was more about karma and causality. And Clark was reflecting on something he read this morning from the Dalai Lama, where the Dalai Lama seems to have talked about the current situation in Tibet, in the occupation by the Chinese regime, as having come out of previous negative actions by the Tibetans, something like that. So it's getting at the question of how do we relate to the concept of karma in our practice and relate it to causation. And it's often said that one way of understanding our experience is just looking at causes and conditions. Now, I would say that the concept of karma is controversial or certain aspects of the concept of karma are controversial in Western Buddhism. And there's one, probably the most fundamental meaning of karma that I know from the teachings of the Buddha is basically very, very simple. It's saying that when we act in a certain way, we set up tendencies to act in that way in the future. The passage actually is, the Buddha says, intention is karma, and karma in the original language. Intention is karma, more or less saying, if I intend in a generous way, I strengthen generosity. If I intend and then act, with reactivity, I strengthen reactivity. It's as simple as that. And that's the most fundamental meaning of karma, I think, in the teaching. So it's simple in that sense. And we could say that present actions condition future actions, bringing in the concept of causality. To say that I am experiencing this because of something that happened in the past before I was born that I don't know about is tricky on a few levels. And there is this passage from the Buddha, which you cited, where the Buddha, I think in the actual passage, he's saying, if I'm experiencing something, just a painful shoulder right now, or something painful, let's say, maybe not have it be on the physical level, I have a painful experience. Is that necessarily because of past karma, including from before I was born, right? And the Buddha in that passage says, not necessarily, because I think he says there are 8 different dimensions of causality, including the weather, right? And I've heard that passage cited as a reason to be somewhat questioning of the sense of karma from past lives. But it's interesting, I've also seen, I think you're referring to that with Thanissaro Bhikkhu, I've seen, I think, when you actually look at the actual text, translated by Bhikkhu Bodhi, he tends to have a view also that it's not necessarily putting in question. So, different interpretations of the same passage. And maybe last thing to say is that I was at a teachers' meeting, and we were doing experiential exercises. You know that exercise where you have the whole group and you say, whoever this is true of, go on the other side, right? Everyone's over here, and they say, if this happened to you, go to this side and face the group, right? How many people have done something like that exercise? Yeah. It can be very deepening of empathy, compassion, solidarity. And, earlier we had done this with a lot of things, including how many of you have contemplated suicide, right? And 1/3 of the group of the teachers walked to the other side. That was startling, right? And so one of the questions was asked, how many of you believe in more or less karmic influences from past lifetimes? And the response of the teachers was interesting. 1/3 moved to the other side. 1/3 didn't move at all. And 1/3 moved halfway. Right in between, right? It's more or less saying, well, I'm kind of agnostic, right? Don't really know, and I'll just say that generally, when in my own teaching and that of other teachings, the view of multiple lifetimes has not played a significant role, and it doesn't in almost all the teachers I know, with some exceptions. It's interesting. That's a little bit of a long answer. Did you have one?
I'm not sure it's a question.
And then we'll go up here. Yeah. Okay.
Well, I guess it's about anatta.
Okay.
And I love your thing about thick and thin.
Yeah.
But I was recently at a college class reunion, and we love each other, and so many classmates have died already.
Yeah.
And in the sunlight, we look really old. But as someone once said, it seems to me the purpose of old friends is to always see us as being young.
Say again.
The purpose of old friends is to see us always as being young.
Yeah.
Because there is this strong sense of identity.
Yeah.
That even though people have expanded and grown and multiplied in their facets, there's still people you live in the same dorm with, and their walk is the same. There is a densification of identity.
Yeah.
As people get older, and I may delude myself that my ego is getting thinner and thick, or my sense of self, but it's not true for other people in their experience of me, nor is it true in my experience of them. Many of them are highly skilled individuals internally.
Yeah.
I just think there's a miracle of character and selfhood that I don't feel Buddhism is addressing.
Yeah.
And it's a big reason why I'm here, because I love a lot of these guys. And I'm not... and I think in the texture of our lives, the reality of other people is just paramount.
Yeah.
In our experience. And anyway, I just throw that out there.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jeff. Yeah, I actually tend to agree with you that, and I think it's one of, what we call Western Buddhism, if we use that language, is shifting, and there's a lot of ways that it's new things are developing, or another way of saying it is that, as with every time that Buddhism left India and went into another culture, it merged with some of the resources and approaches of the native tradition. And I think that's happening very much here in all sorts of ways, connection, social justice issues. And another area, I think, is some of the emphasis. I don't know if we want to limit it by saying it's linked with Western psychology, but a lot of dimensions are. And I think particularly what you point to, some people, even in Buddhist retreat centers, use the language of talking about the individual soul, or the sense of, my own purpose, vocation. Now, I don't think that's necessarily in conflict with that sense of, pure awareness, right? It's not in conflict necessarily with it, but it's more about the path and about the teachings and practices and how this relates to not self. If I was going to give a whole expanded talk on not self, I'd bring in this point, because I think there's something really crucial about knowing what one's own gifts are, what one's own vocation is, one's calling. The word vocation comes from the sense of hearing, and hearing the calling, going back to the early Christian churches, the word. And so there's something, I think, really crucial about that in terms of one's path. That I think probably is very important to most or all of us. Because part of what we listen to isn't just to go as quickly as we can to go beyond any sense of self, but it's also part of what we hear is and this is more what I was calling the intuitive language. What we hear is what my next step in life is, or what one thing that I hear when I do retreats very strongly is I hear like a sense of next steps, or what's important, or how do I let go of what's less important and be with what's more important. And this is not, a lot of it's practice, but some of it is my own individual offerings to the world, right? Does that get at it some? Yeah. So we could say a lot more about that, but that's crucial. Now, should we take the two other people who wanted to speak and finish with that? And then, yeah, okay, great. Please.
Hi, my name is Greg.
Hi, Greg.
I wanted to get back to something you talked about early in the teaching. You talked about concentration.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little more, because what immediately came to mind, and I think you addressed this, but I may have been thinking so much that I didn't hear you.
Yeah.
I was concentrating on what was going on in my head. But when I think of concentration, I think of like really focusing on what's happening, which is not the goal. I think the goal is to let go of the thoughts and what's happening. So,
Yeah, so what is samadhi is the word in the original language. As I mentioned, it's concentration itself does have those connotations, and I don't use it when I teach very much. I prefer to use the word in the original language. And if you actually look at the etymology of the word samadhi, sam has to do with together. It's actually related to words like summary in English. It's an Indo-European language, so it's going to be some commonality. And so the etymology of samadhi is kind of a gathering together or a bringing together. But it doesn't, so gathering is a little bit different than I will forcefully focus, right? It's a little bit different. And so that's there in the original language. And again, maybe it's because so many Western meditators are goal-oriented and I will do this and I will, put out great effort, that it's, we need to correct that some by many of us bringing in the aspect of ease. But still, there has to be what could be called a proactive effort, an effort to, in the teachings on samadhi, there are factors which indicate the development of samadhi, and the first two are connecting with the object and then staying with it. Right? In fact, the very word samadhi translated into Tibetan is translated as staying with. So there's connecting. I connect with the breath, and then I learn to stay with it. Right? And so we do need to connect and stay with it. And it's just to see that there are different forms of practice. There's one form of practice where we totally focus on being able to connect with one object, object is what I mean by the breath or some other focus area. And very crucial to be able to connect with it and then stay with it. And yet, that needs to be done with a combination of more active and more receptive effort. And so in that situation, if I'm focusing on the breath, I don't want to let it go or go beyond it, but it's a training to be able to stay with it. The purpose is to develop enough stability of mind so we can see our own experience really, really clearly in just our ordinary experience. Does that get at it? Yeah. Thank you. Okay, maybe, and last but not least.
I don't think I have a question.
Okay, next, beyond last but not least. Oh, did you? Who had the question? Okay, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Matthew. My journey to Buddhism has been long and circuitous, and I came of age in the Bay Area in the late 60s, early 70s,
Yeah.
where there's an explosion of everything.
Yeah.
Eastern philosophy, psychedelics, queer liberation, feminism, ecology, all of that. I always say that I tried everything but rolfing and heroin. But heroin. I did try everything but rolfing and heroin. But eventually, for me, my most solid introduction to Buddhism was Thich Nhat Hanh's The Heart of Buddhist Teachings.
Yeah.
And there's something in that book that I love that book, and but there's something in it that I always have a hard time finding some resolution or resolve. No. So I usually kind of ignore it, but I always am interested in what other people's take might be on it. And this is when he's talking about the 3 marks of existence,
Yeah.
just how dukkha, impermanence, and oneself. And in the beginning of the book, he says that the 3 marks of existence are nirvana, impermanence, and non-self. I imagine that he was just trying to de-emphasize the suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And what comes to mind is I heard the story of when Thich Nhat Hanh visited the city center, San Francisco's city center, and as he looked out over the practitioners, I think the first words that came out of his mouth were, "Why is everybody looking so grim?"
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering, and he says in the book, well, no, you can look at Buddhist teachings that nirvana is like, instead of dukkha, is one of the 3 marks of existence. And I just, were you aware of his philosophy about that? I'm just wondering what your take on
Yeah. Maybe two reflections about this. Is about Thich Nhat Hanh and passages and maybe talking where he talks about the 3 marks, which is one way that I've used the language, the seeing that frees, and emphasize the more active, practice-oriented approach rather than making it more metaphysical, like the 3 marks of existence. I prefer the more active emphasis on 3 ways of seeing. But you'll commonly see that as something like the 3 marks or the 3 aspects. And whether Thich Nhat Hanh apparently substituting nirvana for dukkha, which not a bad thing to do. I don't know of that text, and maybe you can point that towards me, because what I've often thought, and I think I've seen some passages where they're like the 3 ways of seeing are the 3 forms of liberating insight, and then fourthly, there's also insight into nirvana. So I have myself sometimes taught like that, and I may have even done that earlier. I don't remember exactly. And so having the 3 and then add nirvana to it, yes. But I think I've never heard, and I know Thich Nhat Hanh's work pretty well, but I don't remember any passage where dukkha got substituted out. There would be some reactivity about that.
There is with me too. It seems like, why did you have to complicate things? Everything was so simple.
Yeah. But I think there is something though to those 3 and then those permit the further insight into nirvana. That does make total sense. Yeah. So maybe we go back. Maybe he was saying something like that. Don't know. Yeah. But I mean, dukkha is so central. I mean, it's in the Four Noble Truths, which is the way many of us first hear about all this. The central focus is on dukkha, and the other two don't hardly get mentioned, right? So, but yeah, and maybe we can go back and look at that and see. Yeah, thanks, Matthew. Okay, so should we? We're going back into silence now. Why don't we take a minute just to sit quietly, and then we could either take a walk. Lunch is in a little over 15 minutes. Remember the practice of looking at pleasant and unpleasant and reactivity. I'll give my report later about what happens with dessert for me. Okay. So about a minute to sit quietly. Thank you so much for the kind attention and the very full discussion, and we'll actually have the recording available later. Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.